Jake Morrison had survived blizzards, wildfires, and the kind of losses that hollow out a man from the inside. But nothing prepared him for what he saw that morning. After 3 days snowed in by the worst Montana storm in 20 years, he stepped out expecting wreckage. What he found were tracks, massive ones, hooves the size of dinner plates, dragging through snow like something had fought its way through hell. A bison, but not just any bison. This one wasn't supposed to be here, not in these mountains, not in this season, not after what had happened last time. The cattle were spooked. Scout, his loyal dog, wouldn't go near the tree line. And Jake? Jake knew those tracks told a story, a brutal one. Because this time, the bison wasn't running away, it was coming back. And it remembered everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Jake Morrison's ranch, turning the snow-covered Montana landscape into a deceptive masterpiece of pristine beauty. But Jake wasn't admiring the view as he stepped off his porch, rifle slung across his shoulder and coffee steam rising from his thermos in the bitter air. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of ranching, gripped the metal rail as he surveyed what the blizzard had left behind. 3 days. That's how long the worst storm in 20 years had kept him trapped inside the farmhouse, listening to the wind howl like a banshee and praying his cattle had found shelter. Now at first light, the damage was becoming clear. Fence posts snapped like matchsticks, their wire tangled in frozen sculptures across the fields. The barn's roof had held, thank God, but power lines draped the ground like dead snakes, and his pickup truck sat buried under a drift that reached the windows. "Come on, Scout," Jake called to the border collie mix, who'd been his constant companion for the past 3 years. The dog emerged from the barn, his black and white coat pristine against the snow, intelligent brown eyes already scanning the horizon with that uncanny awareness that had made him invaluable on the ranch. Scout had come to Jake broken physically and emotionally. Found him half dead in a ditch, ribs showing through matted fur, flinching at every human gesture. Took months of patient coaxing before the dog would eat from his hand, longer still before Scout trusted enough to sleep inside. But once that trust formed, it became unbreakable. Scout seemed to understand Jake's moods, his needs, sometimes better than Jake understood them himself. They made an odd pair, the gruff rancher and the intuitive dog, but they worked together like pieces of the same machine. Scout could read cattle better than most cowboys, could sense weather changes hours before the radio confirmed them, and had never once failed to alert Jake to real danger, which made this morning's discovery all the more unsettling. Jake crunched through knee-deep snow toward the main pasture, Scout padding silently beside him. The first sign of trouble was the scattered cattle, huddled in groups far from where they should be, their breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. But what stopped Jake cold was what he saw in the snow between the barn and the tree line. Tracks. Massive, deep impressions that could only belong to one animal. Bison. Jake knelt beside the nearest print, his experienced eye reading the story written in frozen earth. The tracks were fresh, probably made during the night when the storm finally broke. But these weren't the neat, measured steps of an animal passing through. These gouges showed desperation, deep furrows where hooves had struggled for purchase. Drag marks where something heavy had fought through drifts that would challenge even a creature weighing 2,000 pounds. "What do you think, boy?" Jake murmured, but when he looked up, Scout was behaving strangely. The dog stood frozen, every muscle tense, but not in his usual alert stance. This was different. Scout's ears were pricked forward, but his tail hung low, and there was something in his posture that Jake had learned to recognize, the same careful stillness the dog had shown in those first months, when every instinct screamed caution. The tracks led directly toward the main barn. Jake straightened slowly, his knees protesting the movement. At 62, he felt every year and every hard decision that had brought him to this moment. 28 years since he'd inherited this ranch from his father. 26 years since he'd married Sarah, thinking they'd build something lasting together. 6 months since cancer had taken her, leaving him with nothing but memories and a dog who seemed to understand grief better than most humans. The rifle felt heavier as he followed the tracks, Scout moving with unusual reluctance beside him. In all their time together, Jake had never seen his dog hesitate when investigating something on the ranch. Scout was brave to a fault, had charged at coyotes twice his size to protect the herd, had never backed down from anything that threatened their home. But now, as they approached the barn, Scout kept glancing up at Jake with an expression that almost looked like worry. The barn doors were still latched, which was good. Whatever had made these tracks hadn't broken in. But as Jake rounded the corner to check the side entrance, he stopped breathing. Through the frost-covered window, he could see a massive shadow moving inside. The bison, and it had to be a bison. Nothing else could cast a silhouette that large was inside his barn. Inside the building where he stored the winter hay that would keep his cattle alive until spring. The same building where he kept his equipment, his livelihood, everything that mattered to his survival out here in the middle of nowhere. Jake's hands found the rifle's familiar weight automatically. Protocol was clear when it came to wildlife threatening livestock or property. Montana law was on his side. Hell, any rancher in the state would tell him the same thing: dangerous animal. On your property, you deal with it. Clean, quick, necessary. But Scout whined softly, a sound Jake had never heard from him before. The dog sat down in the snow, deliberately placing himself between Jake and the barn. When Jake took a step forward, Scout didn't move, just looked up at him with those knowing brown eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of understanding. "What is it, boy?" Jake whispered, his breath creating a small cloud between them. "What are you trying to tell me?" For a moment, rancher and dog stared at each other while the shadow in the barn moved restlessly back and forth. Jake could hear his cattle lowing nervously in the distance, could see his neighbor Tom Patterson's truck already heading up the drive, probably coming to check on storm damage and ready to offer help with whatever crisis the morning had brought. But all Jake could think about was the expression in Scout's eyes, and the way his most trusted companion was refusing to let him approach what any reasonable person would call a clear and present danger. The shadow moved again, massive and imposing, and Jake tightened his grip on the rifle while Scout remained perfectly still. A living barrier between practicality and something Jake couldn't yet understand. Jake pushed open the barn's side door with deliberate slowness, the hinges protesting with a metallic screech that echoed through the cavernous space. The rifle felt solid in his hands, a Winchester .3006 that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him. 3 generations of Morrison men had used this weapon to protect their livelihood, and Jake knew its weight, its balance, its deadly accuracy at close range. But as he stepped into the barn's shadowy interior, Scout's behavior became even more disturbing. The dog followed, but stayed pressed against Jake's left leg, trembling slightly. Not from cold. Scout had weathered Montana winters his entire life, but from something else entirely. Something that made the usually fearless cattle dog move like he was walking into a minefield. The barn stretched before them, 40 feet of open space between towering stacks of winter hay and the reinforced stalls that housed Jake's equipment. Shafts of morning sunlight slanted through gaps in the boards, creating a lattice of gold and shadow that made it hard to distinguish shapes clearly. But there was no mistaking the massive form positioned near the far end, blocking access to the hay storage area. The bison was even larger than Jake had imagined, standing nearly 6 feet at the shoulder, with a massive head crowned by curved horns that could gore a man to death with casual ease. Her dark brown coat was matted with ice and snow, and when she turned slightly in response to their entrance, Jake caught a glimpse of intelligent eyes that tracked his every movement. Sage, though Jake wouldn't learn her name for hours yet, stood with her back to the hay bales, head lowered in classic defensive posture. But there was something calculated about her positioning, something that spoke of intelligence rather than mere animal instinct. She wasn't simply taking shelter or looking for food. She was guarding something. "Easy, girl," Jake murmured, raising the rifle slowly. The protocol was clear: one clean shot to the head, quick and humane. No rancher in Montana would fault him for protecting his winter feed. Hell, Tom Patterson would probably commend him for handling it efficiently. But Scout had other ideas. As Jake brought the rifle to his shoulder, the dog stepped directly into his line of fire. Not beside him, not behind him, but right in front of the barrel, placing his body between the weapon and its intended target. When Jake tried to sidestep for a clear shot, Scout moved too, maintaining his position with the kind of stubborn determination Jake had only seen when the dog was protecting injured calves from coyotes. "Scout, move," Jake commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had trained the dog to respond instantly to dozens of herding commands. But Scout didn't budge. Instead, he sat down deliberately in the hay-strewn dirt, tail tucked, ears forward, eyes fixed not on Jake but on the bison. The standoff stretched between them, man, dog, and wild animal, each perfectly still in the filtered morning light. Jake's finger rested against the trigger guard, muscle memory from decades of hunting, telling him exactly how much pressure to apply. But Scout's unprecedented disobedience created a doubt that gnawed at him like physical pain. In 3 years of partnership, Scout had never once failed to follow a direct command, never hesitated when Jake needed him to move cattle, never refused to come when called, never positioned himself between Jake and anything Jake considered a threat. The dog's instincts had saved the ranch more than once, alerting to predators, sensing storms, even finding lost cattle in conditions where human senses failed completely. So why was he protecting a dangerous wild animal? The question was interrupted by the rumble of a diesel engine outside. Through the barn's open door, Jake could see Tom Patterson's weathered Chevy pulling into the yard, followed by a cloud of exhaust that dissipated quickly in the cold air. Tom had been Jake's neighbor for 40 years, his mentor after Jake's father died, and the closest thing to family Jake had left since Sarah's passing. "Jake," Tom's voice carried across the yard, gravelly with age and cigarettes. "Everything all right over here? Saw your lights on early and wanted to check storm damage." The bison shifted slightly at the sound of the approaching voice, but instead of the aggressive charge Jake expected, Sage simply repositioned herself more firmly in front of the hay storage. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, lacking the wild panic that should characterize a trapped animal. She was choosing her ground, not reacting blindly to human presence. Scout whined softly again, that same unusual sound that had stopped Jake cold outside. The dog's eyes moved between Jake and the bison, then back again, as if he were trying to communicate something urgently important, something Jake was missing entirely. "In the barn, Tom," Jake called back, never taking his eyes off the massive animal before him. "Got ourselves a situation here." Tom's footsteps crunched through the snow, growing closer. Jake knew what would happen when his neighbor arrived. Tom would see the bison, see the threat to the winter hay, and demand immediate action. Tom Patterson had been ranching longer than Jake had been alive, and his philosophy was simple: problems got solved quickly and decisively, or they became bigger problems. But as Jake waited for Tom's arrival, he found himself studying the bison more carefully. Sage's breathing was controlled, not labored. Her stance was defensive but not aggressive. Most tellingly, she hadn't charged when Jake entered the barn, with a rifle behavior that seemed almost impossibly restrained for a wild animal defending territory. "Jesus Christ, Jake!" Tom's voice exploded from the doorway as he took in the scene. "What the hell is that thing doing in your barn? And why haven't you put it down yet? Tom Patterson stood silhouetted in the morning light, a compact man in his 70s with the kind of weathered toughness that came from surviving 60 years of Montana winters. His expression shifted from concern to disbelief to anger as he processed what he was seeing. "Been trying to get a clear shot," Jake said carefully, not mentioning Scout's interference. "Just making sure I do this right. Right?" Tom stepped into the barn, his own rifle already in hand. "Jake, that thing is eating your winter hay. Your cattle are gonna starve come February if you don't have that feed." What's to think about? The logical part of Jake's mind agreed completely. The hay represented months of preparation, thousands of dollars in investment, and the difference between keeping his herd alive and losing everything. No reasonable rancher would hesitate, but Scout remained planted between them and the bison, and something about the dog's absolute certainty made Jake pause. "Give me another minute, Tom," Jake said, his voice steady despite the confusion churning. In his chest, something's not right here. Tom's weathered face darkened with frustration, and Jake could see the older man's patience wearing thin along with his confidence in Jake's judgment. 2 hours later, Jake stood in his kitchen, cell, phone pressed to his ear while Tom paced the living room like a caged animal. Through the window, they could see the barn where Sage remained positioned near the hay storage, and Scout continued his vigil by the door, not inside, not outside, but perfectly positioned to intervene if anyone tried to approach with hostile intent. "Dr. Vasquez," Jake said when the call connected. "It's Jake Morrison out on Copper Creek Road. I need your expertise on something unusual." Elena Vasquez had been the region's wildlife veterinarian for 8 years, ever since graduating from Colorado State and deciding that Montana's rugged landscape suited her better than any city practice. Jake had worked with her twice before, once when a mountain lion had taken up residence too close to his cattle, and again when an injured elk had needed relocation. She was practical, professional, and understood the delicate balance between conservation and livelihood that defined rural life. "Jake, good to hear from you." Elena's voice carried that calm competence that had made her invaluable to ranchers throughout the valley. "Tom Patterson called me 20 minutes ago. He mentioned something about a bison situation." Jake shot a look at Tom, who had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "He did he? Well, that saves me some explaining. How fast can you get out here? I'm already loading my equipment." "Should be there within the hour." "Tom mentioned you were hesitating to handle this yourself, which honestly surprised me. You've never needed hand-holding with wildlife management before." The comment stung because it was true. Jake Morrison had a reputation throughout the valley as someone who handled problems efficiently and without drama. Ranchers called him when they needed advice on difficult decisions. Game wardens trusted his judgment about wildlife populations. The fact that he was second-guessing himself over what should be a straightforward situation felt like a betrayal of everything he'd built his life around. "There are some unusual circumstances," Jake said carefully. "I'd rather have you take a look before we proceed." "Unusual how?" Elena's professional curiosity was evident in her tone. "Bison behavior is generally pretty predictable, especially when they're displaced by weather." Jake watched Scout through the window, noting how the dog had positioned himself to maintain visual contact with both the barn and the house. "My dog is acting strange." Scout's never wrong about these things, and he's protective of the animal. "Won't let me get close enough for a clean shot." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence on the phone stretched long enough that Jake wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Elena spoke, her voice thoughtful. "Protective how exactly?" "Placing himself between me and the target, refusing direct commands. Behavior I've never seen from him in 3 years. Interesting." Jake could hear Elena moving around, the metallic sounds of equipment being loaded, Dogs can sense things we miss: stress hormones, injury, even pregnancy in some cases. Have you been able to observe the animal's behavior directly? She's not exhibiting typical aggressive patterns. Defensive positioning, but calculated. Almost like she's guarding something specific rather than just taking shelter. Tom stopped pacing and fixed Jake with a stare that could have melted the remaining snow. Guarding what? Your hay that's gonna keep your cattle alive through the winter. Jake, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, and I've never seen you overthink a simple problem like this. But Elena had caught something in Jake's description. You said she. How do you know the animal's female? Jake paused, realizing he'd been thinking of the bison as female without conscious decision. Body structure, I suppose. Smaller than a bull, different proportions. But I haven't gotten close enough for definitive identification. I'll be there in 45 minutes, Elena said, her voice carrying new urgency. In the meantime, do not approach the animal. If Scout's instincts are telling him something's wrong, there might be factors we're not seeing. As Jake hung up, Tom's frustration finally boiled over. Factors we're not seeing? Jake, what's gotten into you? Your daddy would have had that animal down and dressed by now, and your granddaddy before him. 3 generations of Morrison men built this ranch by making hard decisions quickly, not by consulting every expert in the county about obvious problems. The words hit harder than Tom probably intended, carrying echoes of every doubt Jake had harbored since Sarah's death. Was he getting soft? Had grief compromised his judgment? The questions had haunted him through 6 months of lonely evenings. And now they crystallized around this moment of hesitation. But before Jake could respond, Scout began barking from outside, not his usual alert bark, but something more urgent. Both men rushed to the window in time to see a small sedan navigating the snow-covered driveway with the determined persistence of someone who'd learned to drive in Montana winters. That's not Elena, Tom muttered. She drives that big Ford pickup. The sedan parked beside Tom's truck, and a young Asian woman emerged, pulling a heavy camera bag from the back seat. Even from a distance, Jake could see the press credentials hanging from her neck. Sarah Chun, Channel 8 News, the woman called out as she approached the porch, her city shoes slipping slightly on the packed snow. I heard on the scanner about a wildlife situation out here. Mind if I ask a few questions? Tom's expression darkened further. Just what we need: media attention. Jake, you call that vet and tell her to get here faster, or I'm calling Fish and Game myself. This situation's about to get complicated in ways you don't want. But Jake was watching Scout, whose agitated barking had shifted to something else entirely. The dog had moved closer to the barn, but instead of his earlier protective stance, he seemed to be trying to lead them somewhere specific. His behavior had the purposeful quality Jake recognized from cattle work Scout, trying to communicate specific information about specific locations. Sarah Chun reached the porch, breath visible in the cold air, notebook already in hand. Mr. Morrison, I understand you have a bison on your property. Is it true you're waiting for wildlife experts rather than handling the situation yourself? The question, innocent enough on its surface, felt loaded with implications about competence, decisiveness, and the kind of rancher Jake Morrison really was. Elena Vasquez arrived 15 minutes later, her Ford F-250 rumbling into the yard with the confidence of someone who'd navigated Montana back roads in every conceivable weather condition. She emerged from the truck like a woman on a mission, her veterinary kit slung over one shoulder, and a tranquilizer rifle secured in a custom mount behind the driver's seat. Jake, she nodded tersely, then acknowledged Tom and Sarah with professional courtesy that didn't quite mask her irritation at the reporter's presence. Let's have a look at your problem. But as they approached the barn, Scout's behavior became even more extraordinary. Instead of his earlier protective positioning, the dog began moving with deliberate purpose, leading the small group toward the barn's side entrance while carefully avoiding the main doors. where they'd first encountered Sage. He's trying to show us something, Jake said, following Scout's lead despite Tom's audible grumbling about letting a dog run the show. Elena watched Scout's movements with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years observing animal behavior. Border collies are incredibly intelligent, especially ones with working backgrounds. If he's trying to communicate specific information, we should pay attention. Scout led them around the barn's perimeter, stopping at specific points where he would look back to ensure they were following, then continue with the methodical precision of a professional guide. When they reached the barn's back corner, where the structure met the old hay storage addition, Scout stopped completely and began what could only be described as a controlled whine, urgent but quiet, as if he understood the need for stealth. "There," Elena whispered, pointing to tracks in the snow that were smaller than the massive prints they'd followed earlier. "Those are calf tracks, recent ones." Jake felt his world shift on its axis. Everything they'd assumed about the situation, the aggressive intruder, the simple threat to his livelihood, the straightforward solution crumbled in the face of this new evidence. Scout hadn't been protecting a dangerous wild animal. He'd been protecting a mother. Sarah Chun raised her camera, but Elena's sharp gesture stopped her. No flash, no sudden movements. If there's an injured calf in there, stress could kill it. They entered the barn through the rear access, moving with the careful quiet of people who'd suddenly realized they were walking into a nursery rather than a battleground. The interior felt different now, charged with maternal energy rather than territorial aggression. Sage remained near the hay storage, but her positioning made perfect sense, now not blocking access out of aggression, but standing guard over something precious hidden in the shadows. Scout led them deeper into the barn, past the equipment stalls and around the towering hay bales, until they reached a corner that Jake rarely visited. There, nestled in a carefully constructed depression of loose hay and protected by bales stacked to form natural walls, lay Thunder. The calf was smaller than Jake had expected, probably born late in the season and still vulnerable to Montana's harsh weather. But what stopped everyone cold was the obvious injury: his left rear leg, bent at an unnatural angle, the bone clearly fractured above the ankle. The young bison looked up at the approaching humans with eyes that held pain but not fear, as if Scout's presence had somehow communicated that these strange creatures meant no harm. "My God," Elena breathed, immediately shifting into professional mode as she approached the injured animal. "This changes everything. This completely changes everything." Sage watched from her guard position as Elena conducted a careful examination of her calf, the massive mother's eyes tracking every movement, but making no move to interfere. It was as if she understood that these humans represented help rather than threat, a level of trust that seemed impossible given the circumstances. "The fracture is severe," Elena reported, her hands gentle as she examined Thunder's leg. "Probably happened during the storm when the herd scattered. Mother kept him alive by finding shelter and staying with him, but he needs immediate medical attention or he'll lose the leg entirely." Tom Patterson stood frozen, his entire worldview rewriting itself as he watched the scene unfold. The dangerous intruder was a desperate mother who'd found the only shelter available for her injured child. The threat to the winter hay was a family in crisis using Jake's barn as a makeshift hospital. "How long have they been here?" Sarah asked quietly, her camera forgotten as she watched Thunder nuzzle weakly against his mother's massive head. "Based on the tracks and the settled appearance of their nest, probably since the first night of the storm," Elena replied. 3 days. This mother has been caring for her injured calf for 3 days, probably without food or water herself, maintaining constant vigil in case help arrived or threats appeared. Jake sank down beside Scout, running his hands through the dog's thick fur as understanding washed over him. Scout had recognized something that escaped every human observer, that aggression and desperation often wore the same face. That protective mothers and dangerous animals could look identical to eyes that only saw the surface. "You knew, didn't you, boy?" Jake whispered. You could tell she was protecting something precious, not threatening something you cared about. "Scouts." Tail wagged slightly, the first relaxed gesture he'd made since discovering the tracks that morning. His posture had shifted completely now that the humans understood what he'd been trying to communicate. The dog moved closer to Thunder, lying down beside the injured calf with the gentle care of a creature who'd learned that compassion was sometimes more powerful than force. Elena was already preparing emergency medical supplies, her movements efficient despite the unprecedented nature of treating a wild bison calf in a rancher's barn. "Jake, I need to stabilize this fracture immediately. The longer we wait, the more likely he is to lose the leg entirely." But it was Tom Patterson who spoke the words that crystallized the moment's significance. "40 years I've been ranching," he said slowly, his voice thick with emotion. 40 years of making hard decisions and never looking back. But I've never seen anything like this. Never seen a wild animal trust humans enough to let us near her injured child." As Elena began the delicate process of emergency veterinary care, with Sage watching anxiously from nearby, and Scout serving as a calming presence for the injured calf, Jake realized that his moment of hesitation had saved more than just two animals. It had revealed the complexity hidden beneath surface appearances, the wisdom that came from truly listening rather than simply reacting. The rifle that had felt so necessary just hours ago now seemed like an artifact from a different world entirely. Elena worked with the focused intensity of a surgeon, her hands steady despite the unprecedented nature of her patient. Thunder lay remarkably still as she prepared the materials needed to stabilize his fractured leg-splinting supplies, antiseptic, and a mild sedative that would calm him without endangering his already compromised system. "Jake, I need you to hold his head steady," Elena instructed, her voice carrying the calm authority that had made her invaluable in emergency situations. "Talk to him. Keep him calm while I work." Jake positioned himself beside Thunder's massive head, surprised by how trusting the young bison seemed. The calf's eyes, dark and intelligent, fixed on Jake's face with an expression that seemed almost human in its vulnerability. "Easy, big guy," Jake murmured, his weathered hands gentle against the coarse fur. "We're going to fix you up." Sage watched from 10 feet away, every muscle in her massive frame tense with maternal anxiety. Her breathing was rapid but controlled, and Jake could see the internal struggle written in her posture, the desire to protect her calf warring with some deeper instinct that recognized these humans as helpers rather than threats. Scout had positioned himself between Sage and the medical activity, not as a barrier this time, but as a bridge. The dog's calm presence seemed to communicate to the anxious mother that the strange procedures happening to her child were beneficial rather than harmful. When Thunder whimpered softly as Elena manipulated the fracture, Scout moved closer to the calf's head, offering comfort with the same gentle intelligence he'd shown during Jake's darkest moments after Sarah's death. "The fracture is clean," Elena reported, her hands working with practiced efficiency. "No bone fragments, no signs of infection. If we can stabilize it properly and give him time to heal, he should regain full mobility." Tom Patterson stood near the barn's entrance, his expression cycling between amazement and profound discomfort. Everything he'd believed about wildlife management, about the clear lines between domestic and wild, between threat and victim, had been challenged in the space of an hour. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long for something like this to heal?" 6 to 8 weeks for initial bone fusion, Elena replied, carefully positioning a custom splint around Thunder's leg. "But he'll need constant monitoring, regular medication, and ... She paused, the implications of her medical assessment settling over the group like a heavy blanket. "He'll need shelter and care, the kind of round-the-clock attention that wild animals don't usually receive." The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Who was going to provide that care? Wildlife rehabilitation facilities weren't equipped for animals this large. Zoos had strict protocols about accepting injured wild animals. The most logical solution, and the one that state wildlife officials would probably recommend, was euthanasia. "He stays here," Jake said quietly, the words surprising even himself. "They both stay here until he's healed enough for release." Sarah. Chun looked up from the notes she'd been scribbling, her journalist's instincts recognizing a story that transcended simple human interest. "Mr. Morrison, are you saying you're willing to house and care for wild bison on your ranch? For weeks? Or potentially months?" Jake met her gaze steadily. "I'm saying that Scout saw something I missed. That sometimes the right thing to do isn't the easy thing to do." He glanced at Tom, whose weathered face reflected decades of difficult decisions. "My father and grandfather made hard choices to protect this ranch. Maybe it's time I made some hard choices to protect something else." Elena paused in her work to study Jake's face. "This isn't a decision to make lightly. Wild animals aren't pets, Jake. Even with the best intentions, there are risks to you, to your livestock, to them. State wildlife officials will need to be involved. There will be permits, inspections, liability issues. And expense," Tom added practically. "Veterinary bills, specialized feed, facility modifications." "Jake, you're talking about a significant financial commitment on top of everything else." But as they discussed the practical challenges, something remarkable was happening. Thunder had relaxed completely under Elena's care, his breathing steady and pain-free for the first time since his injury. More significantly, Sage had moved closer, her massive head lowering, until she could nuzzle her calf gently while the humans worked around them. The scene was surreal, a wild bison mother allowing strangers to provide medical care to her child, trusting these peculiar two-legged creatures with the most precious thing in her world. Scout lay beside Thunder's uninjured side, his presence creating a calm island environment that seemed to encompass all species present. "There's something else you need to consider," Elena said, securing the final wrapping on Thunder's splint. "If this works, if we can heal him and eventually reunite them with their herd, it could change how wildlife management is handled throughout the region. This kind of intervention, this level of cooperation between ranchers and wild animals, it's unprecedented." Sarah Chun was documenting everything with both camera and notebook, her initial skepticism about rural wisdom evolving into genuine fascination. "Dr. Vasquez, in your professional opinion, what are the chances of success? If Mr. Morrison provides the care environment, if you oversee the medical treatment, what's the likelihood that this calf can be returned to the wild?" Elena considered the question carefully while checking Thunder's vital signs. "Honestly, better than I would have expected when I first arrived here. The fracture is manageable. The calf's overall health is good despite the trauma, and most importantly," she gestured toward Sage, who was now lying down beside her son, creating a protective barrier with her massive body, "he has a mother who never gave up on him. That kind of care, that emotional bond, it's impossible to replicate artificially." Tom Patterson approached slowly, his boots crunching on the hay-strewn floor. For a moment, he stood looking down at the unlikely family group: injured calf, protective mother, gentle dog, and determined humans. When he spoke, his voice carried a grudging respect that Jake hadn't heard in years. "Your daddy would be proud, Jake, not because you made the easy choice, but because you made the right one. Even when it meant admitting you didn't know everything." Tom paused, studying Sage's massive form. "I'll help however I can. Ranch this size, you're going to need assistance with daily care." As if sensing the shift in the humans around him, Thunder lifted his head slightly, his dark eyes moving from face to face with what could only be described as gratitude. By evening, Jake's ranch had transformed into something resembling a small convention center. Word of the Bison rescue had spread through the valley with the speed that only rural communities could achieve, carried by CB radios, phone calls, and a kind of informal network that connected every ranch, feed store, and coffee shop within. 50 miles. Sarah Chun's initial news report had aired on the 6 o'clock broadcast, complete with footage of Thunder receiving medical care while his mother watched protectively. The story had struck a chord that surprised even Sarah. Her station's phone had been ringing, constantly, with viewers wanting to know how they could help, how they could visit, and whether this kind of cooperation between ranchers and wildlife was becoming more common. "I've never seen response like this," Sarah told Jake as they stood in his kitchen, watching through the window as vehicles continued to arrive in his yard. The story's been picked up by networks in Denver and Salt Lake City. There's talk of national coverage if this continues to develop positively. Jake poured coffee for what felt like the 20th time that day, his modest kitchen having become an informal command center for an operation he'd never intended to begin. The dining table was covered with business cards from wildlife organizations, volunteer forms from local residents, and a stack of permits that Elena was helping him navigate. "I just wanted to keep my cattle safe," Jake muttered, though there was no real complaint in his voice. "Now I've apparently become a case study in interspecies cooperation." The barn had become a pilgrimage site of sorts. Elena had established strict visiting protocols: no more than 4 people at a time, no flash photography, no loud noises, but there was a steady stream of curious neighbors, wildlife enthusiasts, and fellow ranchers who wanted to see the unprecedented situation for themselves. What surprised Jake most was the support from other ranchers. Men and women who'd spent their lives making hard, pragmatic decisions were arriving with offers of hay, expertise, and labor. Betty Hawkins from the Double Bar Ranch had brought home-cooked meals for what she called the humans working too hard to remember dinner. Marcus Wright had arrived with specialized fencing materials, explaining that if Jake was going to house wild animals, he needed proper containment areas for everyone's safety. "This is bigger than just your ranch now," Elena explained as she reviewed the day's medical notes. Thunder's condition had remained stable throughout the afternoon, and Sage had gradually relaxed enough to accept food and water brought by the humans. "What you've done here, what Scout helped you see, it's changing how people think about wildlife management." Tom Patterson emerged from the barn, where he'd been helping to construct a temporary shelter that would give the Bison family more privacy while still allowing for medical monitoring. His face showed the fatigue of a man who'd worked harder in one day than he had in months. But there was something else there too, a satisfaction that Jake hadn't seen in his old friend for years. "That mother is something else," Tom said, accepting a cup of coffee gratefully. "Watches everything we do, but she's starting to trust that we're here to help. And that Caffey's got more fight in him than I expected. Tried to stand up twice this afternoon." Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the Montana Wildlife Federation had arrived an hour earlier, her credentials impressive enough to make even the state wildlife officials take notice. She'd spent considerable time observing Sage and Thunder, documenting behaviors that she claimed were rewriting textbooks about bison maternal instincts and adaptability. "What you have here is unprecedented," Dr. Walsh told the gathered group as evening settled over the ranch. "Wild bison accepting human intervention for their offspring, a working ranch successfully integrating wildlife rehabilitation, and most significantly, a domestic animal scout serving as an intermediary between species. The research implications alone are staggering." But it was Scout himself who remained the most remarkable element of the entire situation. The border collie had appointed himself as unofficial liaison between the human activity and the bison family, spending his day moving between groups, somehow sensing when Sage was becoming stressed by too much attention and gently directing visitors away. When Thunder showed signs of pain or anxiety, Scout would position himself beside the calf's head, his calm presence providing comfort that seemed to work better than medication. I've been studying animal behavior for 20 years, Dr. Walsh continued, watching Scout through the window as he made his evening rounds. But I've never seen a domestic animal demonstrate this level of interspecies empathy and communication. It's as if he's functioning as a translator, helping each species understand the intentions of the others. Jake found himself uncomfortable with the academic attention, but he couldn't deny the evidence. Scout was different now, more purposeful in his movements, more deliberate in his interactions. The dog seemed to understand that he'd been given a responsibility that extended beyond his usual ranch duties, and he was rising to meet it with the same intelligence and dedication he'd always shown. As darkness fell, and the last of the day's visitors departed, Jake stood in the barn doorway watching his unlikely charges. Sage lay protectively beside Thunder, who was resting comfortably despite his injury. Scout had positioned himself where he could monitor both the bison and the barn entrance, his ears pricked for any signs of disturbance. The scene was peaceful in a way that seemed impossible given the morning's tension. But as Jake prepared to return to the house, he noticed something that made him pause. Thunder's eyes were open, and the young bison was watching Jake with an expression that seemed almost like recognition. Not the wariness of a wild animal observing a potential threat, but something closer to acknowledgement, as if the calf understood that this human had chosen to help rather than harm. Elena approached quietly, her veterinary bag in hand for the evening medical check. "How are you feeling about all this?" she asked, following Jake's gaze to the resting family. 24 hours ago, you were planning to shoot that mother. Now you're potentially looking at months of around-the-clock care. Jake considered the question, thinking about Sarah's empty chair at his kitchen table, about the loneliness that had defined his days since cancer took his wife, about the purpose he'd lost when caring for someone else was no longer part of his daily routine. "Feels like something I should have been doing all along," he said finally. "Just took Scout to show me what I was missing." 2 weeks into what Elena had started calling the Morrison experiment, Jake's daily routine had transformed completely. He woke at 5:30 instead of 6, not because the ranch demanded it, but because Thunder had developed a morning ritual that Jake found himself looking forward to more than his first cup of coffee. The young bison would be waiting when Jake entered the barn, alert and expectant despite his immobilized leg. Thunder had learned to recognize the sound of Jake's boots on the wooden floor, the particular cadence that meant breakfast was coming, along with the gentle examination that had become as routine as breathing. "Morning, big guy," Jake would murmur, setting down the bucket of specialized feed that Elena had prescribed. Thunder's response was always the same, a soft rumbling sound that wasn't quite a moo but wasn't silence either. Jake had started thinking of it as Thunder's way of saying good morning back. Sage had undergone her own transformation during those 2 weeks. The massive mother still maintained her protective vigilance, but she'd learned to differentiate between activities that threatened her calf and those that helped him. When Elena arrived for her twice-daily medical checks, Sage would position herself where she could observe every procedure without interfering. When Jake brought food or fresh bedding, she would actually move aside, creating space for him to work. Most remarkably, she had begun to seek out human contact herself. It started with allowing Jake to touch her shoulder while he worked around Thunder, then progressing to accepting scratches behind her ears when she seemed stressed or anxious. By the end of the 2nd week, Sage would actually approach Jake when he entered the barn, her massive head lowering to receive the attention that seemed to calm her as much as it amazed him. "It's unprecedented," Dr. Walsh had told Elena during one of her frequent research visits. "Wild bison don't form attachments to humans. They certainly don't seek out physical affection from potential predators. What we're observing here challenges fundamental assumptions about bovine behavior and adaptation." But Jake wasn't thinking about scientific implications as he sat beside Thunder on a particularly cold morning, helping the calf work through the physical therapy exercises Elena had prescribed. The young bison's leg was healing ahead of schedule, but maintaining muscle tone and joint flexibility required daily effort that Thunder couldn't accomplish alone. "Come on, buddy," Jake encouraged, supporting Thunder's weight as the calf attempted to bear more pressure on his injured leg. "I know it hurts, but you're getting stronger every day." Thunder's determination was remarkable. Despite obvious discomfort, he would push through each exercise with the kind of gritty persistence Jake recognized from his own recovery. After various ranch injuries, the calf seemed to understand that temporary pain led to long-term improvement. A level of reasoning that impressed even Elena. Scout remained the bridge between all interactions, but his role had evolved into something even more sophisticated. The border collie had learned to read Thunder's energy levels with uncanny accuracy, knowing when the calf was up for physical therapy and when he needed rest. He could sense Sage's moods before the humans recognized them, positioning himself to provide comfort when she became anxious or creating space when she needed solitude. Most impressively, Scout had begun what could only be described as teaching Thunder about ranch life. The dog would demonstrate behaviors, how to respond to certain sounds, how to remain calm during human activity, how to differentiate between routine ranch operations and genuine threats. Thunder absorbed these lessons, with the quick intelligence of young animals, gradually becoming more comfortable with the sights and sounds of domestic life. "It's like watching a master class in interspecies communication," Sarah Chun observed during one of her follow-up visits. The reporter had become a regular presence, documenting the daily progress for what had evolved into a weekly feature story. Scout isn't just comforting them, he's actively educating them about coexisting with humans. Jake had started spending entire mornings in the barn, finding excuses to linger after the necessary work was completed. There was something profoundly peaceful about the routine of care, the simple satisfaction of seeing improvement day by day. Thunder's appetite had returned completely. His coat had regained its glossy health, and his personality was emerging more clearly as his pain decreased. The calf was curious about everything, investigating new objects with the fearless enthusiasm of youth. He would watch Jake's movements with intense concentration, as if memorizing the patterns of human behavior. When Jake worked on other projects in the barn, Thunder would crane his neck to observe, sometimes offering that soft rumbling commentary that Jake had learned meant contentment. Sage had revealed her own personality quirks during the extended stay. She was particular about her food, preferring certain types of hay over others. She had favorite scratching spots that she would present to Jake with the expectation of service. Most endearingly, she had developed a protective attitude toward Scout, treating the dog almost like an honorary member of her family unit. The emotional healing happening in the barn extended beyond the Bison family. Jake found himself talking to Thunder and Sage about things he hadn't shared with anyone since Sarah's death: his fears about the ranch's future, his loneliness, his uncertainty about growing old alone. The animals listened with the patient attention that only non-judgmental companions could provide. "You know what's remarkable?" Elena said one evening as she completed Thunder's medical check. "His bone density is actually improving faster than normal. The combination of good nutrition, regular exercise, and emotional security, it's creating optimal healing conditions." Tom Patterson had become a daily presence as well, arriving each morning to help with feeding and barn maintenance. The older rancher had grown particularly attached to Sage, whose dignified bearing reminded him of prize cattle he'd known in his youth. "Never thought I'd see the day when I'd be hand-feeding a wild bison," Tom admitted, offering Sage her favorite alfalfa. "Hey, but there's something about her intelligence, her trust, it changes how you think about what animals are capable of." As the third week began, Thunder took his first unassisted steps since the injury. Jake, Elena, and Scout watched as the young Bison carefully tested his weight on the healing leg, wobbling slightly but maintaining his balance. Sage rumbled with what could only be described as pride nuzzling her son's neck in encouragement. But even as they celebrated Thunder's progress, everyone understood that success would ultimately be measured by how well they could let go. Morning and Elena declared Thunder ready for release dawned gray and bitter, with the kind of penetrating cold that made even experienced Montanans think twice about venturing outside. Jake stood at his kitchen window, coffee growing cold in his hands, watching Scout make his usual morning rounds. The dog's behavior had changed subtly over the past few days, as if he sensed what the humans were planning. "Jake, we need to talk." "About logistics," Elena said, spreading topographical maps across his dining table. She'd arrived early to discuss the reunification process. Her veterinary expertise now extended to include wildlife relocation strategies. The tracking team located the main herd yesterday. They're about 12 miles north, in the protected valley near Cascade Creek, 12 miles. Jake studied the maps, tracing the route they would need to take with his finger. 12 miles between Thunder's current safety and his return to the wild. 12 miles between the strange little family that had formed in Jake's barn and the natural order that everyone agreed was best for the animals. "How's his mobility?" Jake asked, though he knew the answer. Thunder had been walking normally for a week, even attempting short runs when he thought no one was watching. The young bison's leg had healed completely, stronger now than before the injury, according to Elena's assessment. "Perfect," Elena replied. "Better than perfect, actually. The fracture site shows exceptional bone density. Physically, he's ready for anything wild bison encounter." She paused, studying Jake's expression. "The question is whether we're ready." Tom Patterson arrived as they were discussing transportation logistics, stamping snow off his boots and bringing the sharp scent of winter air into the warm kitchen. His face showed the same conflicted emotions Jake had been wrestling with for days: pride in Thunder's recovery, mixed with grief over the approaching separation. "Herd's been asking about him," Tom announced, helping himself to coffee. "That's what the tracking team says anyway. Other bison calling in a pattern they associate with missing family members. His mother's probably been answering, but from this distance." He shrugged, the gesture conveying everything words couldn't about the complexity of animal relationships. Jake had been avoiding the barn that morning, postponing the moment when he would see Thunder and Sage and have to reconcile their obvious contentment with the necessity of departure. The young bison had grown during his recovery, filling out into the robust health that wild animals needed for survival. Sage had regained the sleek condition of a well-fed matriarch, her coat glossy and her bearing confident. They were ready to leave. More than ready, they needed to leave, for their own well-being and for the integrity of their species. Jake understood this intellectually, had understood it from the beginning. But understanding and accepting were proving to be entirely different things. "There's something else," Elena said carefully. "Dr. Walsh has been in contact with several universities about documenting the reunification process. The scientific community is calling this the most successful case of human-wildlife intervention and temporary domestication reversal on record." "Meaning?" Jake asked, though he suspected where this was heading. "Meaning there will be observers, cameras, probably media coverage. The reunification itself has become almost as significant as the rescue." Elena's expression showed her own discomfort with the attention. "I've tried to minimize the circus atmosphere, but there's genuine scientific value in documenting how Sage and Thunder readjust to wild behavior patterns." Scout appeared at the kitchen door, his usual request for entry, but when Jake opened it, the dog didn't come inside. Instead, he looked up at Jake with an expression that seemed almost urgent, then turned and trotted toward the barn. The message was clear. Something was happening that required attention. They found Sage pacing restlessly in the barn, her massive frame moving with an energy they hadn't seen since her first days of captivity. Thunder stood near the hay storage, but his posture was different too: alert, listening, his head raised as if hearing sounds that escaped human ears. They know, Elena said softly. Somehow they know the herd is calling. Jake approached Thunder slowly, noting how the young bison's attention kept shifting toward the barn's north-facing wall, the direction of Cascade Creek and his scattered family. When Jake reached out to scratch behind Thunder's ears, the usual gesture of affection, Thunder accepted the touch but remained distracted, his focus clearly elsewhere. "It's time, isn't it?" Jake said, though it wasn't really a question. Scout positioned himself between Jake and the restless Bison family, but his usual protective stance had evolved into something else, a farewell positioning that seemed to acknowledge the approaching separation while ensuring it happened peacefully. The preparations took most of the day. Elena coordinated with the tracking team to ensure the herd's location remained stable. A specialized livestock trailer was brought in, modified with extra padding and ventilation for the 12-mile journey. Dr. Walsh arrived with her documentation equipment, followed by a small convoy of wildlife officials, university researchers, and carefully selected media representatives. Jake found himself moving through the preparations mechanically, his hands performing familiar tasks while his mind struggled with the emotional complexity of the day. Thunder and Sage would be returned to their natural family, their natural environment, their natural lives. This was success by every measure that mattered. So why did it feel like loss? As evening approached and the final arrangements were completed, Jake made one last visit to the barn alone. Thunder and Sage were both resting, but their alert postures showed they were aware of the unusual activity surrounding them. Scout lay between them, his presence a comforting constant in the midst of preparation and change. "You've been good guests," Jake said quietly, settling onto a hay bale near Thunder's resting spot. "Better than good, you've been family." Thunder raised his massive head, those intelligent dark eyes focusing on Jake's face with what seemed like understanding. Sage rumbled softly, a sound Jake had learned to interpret as contentment mixed with anticipation. As Jake sat in the quiet barn, surrounded by the animals that had transformed his understanding of connection and communication, he realized that tomorrow's reunion would mark not just Thunder's return to the wild, but Jake's own return to a loneliness he'd temporarily forgotten existed. Dawn came too soon, and not soon enough. Jake had spent the night checking on Thunder and Sage every few hours, finding excuses to ensure their comfort while really just postponing the inevitable goodbye. Scout had remained in the barn overnight, positioning himself as a calm presence. Amid the subtle energy of departure that seemed to emanate from both Bison, the convoy assembled at first, Light Elena's veterinary truck leading, followed by the modified livestock trailer, Dr. Walsh's research vehicle, and a careful selection of media representatives who'd agreed to maintain respectful distance during the actual reunification. Jake rode in the passenger seat of Elena's truck, Scout beside him, both of them watching the trailer ahead that carried their temporary family toward freedom. "They're traveling well," Elena reported, monitoring the audio feed from inside the trailer. Sage and Thunder had loaded with surprising cooperation, as if they understood that this journey led toward something they'd been missing. The soft sounds coming through the speakers, gentle rumbles, and the occasional shift of weight, suggested calm anticipation rather than stress. The route to Cascade Creek wound through terrain that showcased Montana's austere beauty, rolling hills covered in winter grass, stands of cottonwood trees marking water sources, and vast stretches of open range that had supported bison herds for thousands of years. As they climbed toward the protected valley, Jake found himself cataloging details he wanted to remember. The way morning light caught the frost on fence posts, the distant mountains sharp against the pale sky, the sense of being part of something larger than individual concerns. Visual contact with the herd, Dr. Walsh's voice crackled through the radio. Her advance team had positioned themselves on a ridge overlooking the valley where the scattered bison families had gradually regathered. Approximately 40 animals, including several calves, They appear calm but alert. Jake felt his stomach tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. Relief that Thunder would rejoin his extended family. Anxiety about how the herd would receive animals that had spent weeks in human contact. Pride in what they'd accomplished together. Grief for what was ending. The convoy stopped at a predetermined gathering point, a natural clearing where the trailer could be positioned for easy access to the valley floor. Elena and her team began the careful process of preparing for release, while maintaining enough distance to avoid disturbing the waiting herd. Through binoculars, Jake could see the bison in the distance, massive dark shapes against the pale grass, moving with the ancient rhythms that had defined this landscape long before human settlement. Somewhere among them were Thunder's relatives, the family connections that would provide identity and protection throughout his life. "Jake," Elena called softly, "they're ready." The trailer's rear gate opened with mechanical precision, revealing Thunder and Sage silhouetted against the morning light. For a moment, neither animal moved, and Jake wondered if weeks of human contact had diminished their wild instincts. Then Sage stepped forward, her massive head raised, nostrils flaring as she read the complex messages carried on the wind. Thunder followed, his movements showing no trace of his former injury. The young bison stood beside his mother, both of them scanning the valley below with the focused attention of animals recognizing home territory. In the distance, the herd had noticed the arrivals, several adults moving closer with the cautious interest that characterized Bison's social dynamics. Scout remained at Jake's side, but his posture had changed subtly. The dog's usual protective stance had evolved into something that looked almost ceremonial, a final act of service, as he ensured the peaceful transition from domestic care back to wild freedom. "They're calling," Dr. Walsh whispered, her recording equipment capturing sounds too low for human ears to detect clearly. "The herd is welcoming them home." What happened next defied every expectation Jake had formed about wild animal behavior. Instead of immediately rejoining the distant herd, Sage turned back toward the trailer, toward the humans who had cared for her son. She approached slowly, deliberately, until she stood directly in front of Jake. For a long moment, the massive bison and the weathered rancher looked at each other across the species divide that had somehow become bridgeable. Sage lowered her head until her forehead nearly touched Jake's chest, a gesture that felt unmistakably like gratitude. Jake reached up to touch her face one final time, his weathered hands gentle against her coarse fur. "You're welcome," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Take care of him." Thunder approached then, the young bison who had grown from injured victim to healthy adolescent under Jake's care. Like his mother, Thunder offered his own farewell, a soft rumble that Jake had learned to interpret as contentment, followed by a gentle nuzzle that conveyed more than words could express. Scout stepped forward for his own goodbye, touching noses with both bison in a ritual that seemed to release them from the bonds of temporary domestication. The dog's tail wagged once, a final signal of friendship and approval. Then, as naturally as breathing, Sage and Thunder turned toward the valley and began walking toward their herd. Their movements showed no hesitation, no backward glances. They were wild animals returning to their natural place in the world, carrying with them the strength and security that human care had provided during their time of need. The reunification itself was remarkably subdued. The herd accepted Thunder and Sage with the kind of quiet recognition that suggested family bonds, strong enough to survive temporary separation. Within minutes, mother and son had disappeared into the larger group, their individual identities absorbed back into the collective identity of the herd. Jake watched through binoculars until the bison were merely dark spots against the landscape. Then beyond that, until they disappeared entirely into the rolling terrain that would shelter and sustain them. The silence that followed felt profound, not empty, but full of completion. "That," Elena said quietly, "was the most successful wildlife rehabilitation and release I've ever witnessed." But Jake was watching Scout, who sat perfectly still beside him. His intelligent eyes focused on the distant valley where their temporary family had vanished. The dog's posture suggested acceptance rather than loss, wisdom rather than grief. Scout understood what Jake was still learning, that sometimes the greatest act of love was knowing when to let go. 3 months later, Jake Morrison stood in the same spot where he'd said goodbye to Thunder and Sage, but everything had changed. The barn that had served as a wildlife hospital was back to storing hay and equipment, yet it felt different, larger somehow, as if it had been blessed by the extraordinary events it had witnessed. Scout remained Jake's constant companion. But their relationship had evolved beyond the simple partnership of rancher and working dog. The border collie had gained something during those weeks of interspecies communication, a deeper awareness, a confidence in his ability to bridge worlds that others couldn't see. Word of Scout's remarkable intuition had spread throughout the valley, and Jake found himself fielding calls from ranchers dealing with their own wildlife encounters. The Morrison Protocol, Elena called it with a smile. She documented their approach thoroughly, creating guidelines that were being adopted by wildlife management agencies across the region. The core principle was simple: listen before acting. Trust animal wisdom, and remember that aggression often masked deeper needs. Jake's ranch had become an unofficial consultation center for human-wildlife conflicts. Tom Patterson had embraced his role as educator, sharing their experience with anyone willing to listen. 40 years of ranching, he'd tell visitors, and I learned more about animals in those 3 weeks than in all the decades before. Sarah Chun's follow-up stories had won regional journalism awards, but more importantly, they'd sparked conversations about coexistence that rippled far beyond Montana. Schools brought students to hear Jake speak about compassion and communication. Wildlife organizations cited their success in funding proposals. Most remarkably, there had been other successes. A family of elk trapped by flooding near Billings. An injured wolf whose pack waited while humans provided medical care. Each situation was different, but the underlying principle remained constant. See beyond the surface, trust deeper instincts, and remember that healing required patience rather than force. Elena's research had been published in veterinary journals, establishing new protocols for wildlife intervention. But she understood, as they all did, that the real discovery hadn't been scientific, it had been spiritual. They'd learned that communication transcended species, that wisdom often came from unexpected sources, and that sometimes the greatest courage was choosing vulnerability over violence. On quiet evenings, Jake would sit on his porch with Scout. Beside him, watching the horizon where Thunder and Sage had disappeared into their wild freedom. He never saw them again, but he carried the certainty that they thrived somewhere in that vast landscape, stronger for having been loved and wise enough to love in return. Scout would rest his head on Jake's lap during these twilight moments. Both of them changed by an experience that proved the most profound truths often came without words, and that the greatest protection sometimes meant learning when not to pull the trigger.